Hey everybody, welcome back. This is part two of literary criticism, and this one's going to take a look at Aristotelian terms. Aristotle's Poetics casts a large shadow over literary criticism, and it's something that people today still use in reference to understanding how to interpret a particular work of literature. So I want to go over his ideas, make sure that you're familiar with them, and something that I want you to think about as you move beyond this class, how to approach a work of literature and to think about what's happening within the story and how it's affecting us. And Aristotle gives a good way of framing that. Tragedy, according to Aristotle, tragedy is a form of drama based on human suffering that invokes the audience to identify with the characters and narrative. And what this means is generally any type of work of literature is going to seek to get the audience to identify and to feel what the characters feel. Generally, tragedy, though, is based on this idea of human suffering rather than comedy, which is getting us to focus on laughter and joy. Uh, Dramas based on human suffering. And so, what Aristotle argues, the difference between a tragedy and a comedy is degradation without pain. And tragedy has the pain, right? It has that human suffering. So, for instance, in a comedy, if someone, gets, for instance, like in the old cartoons, if someone gets an anvil dropped on them, right? It's supposed to be funny, right? Because they're not necessarily feeling the pain, right? But within tragedy, what we see is that people have great suffering, and so the fact that they feel that suffering, and then more importantly, the audience feels that suffering. That's something that Aristotle wants us to pay attention to. Mimesis, he says, is an imitation of action that seems real because it reflects some elements that is or are true to life. And the way that we think about this mimesis, right, this imitation of action that makes it feel real. So one way that an author draws us in to identify with the characters is making the events seem real. And even if the events don't seem real, as we see here with Knives Out, I mean, most of us aren't going to have these crazy relatives that, that where every single person has a reason to kill someone else in the family. It's not necessarily that realistic, but we can all identify with some aspects of the story, right? So it might not necessarily be we identify with everything within the story, but there's subtle aspects, there's certain attributes, there's certain character traits that we can all identify with that make it seem real, that we can then identify with. Because if we didn't identify with any of the characters, it wouldn't seem interesting, right? So it's just a way of drawing us in. Mimesis is a way of connecting with the audience to pull them into the narrative. Diction and tone. Aristotle says that this is going to be important. It's very similar to what we talked about in part one of literary criticism, thinking about the author, right? This is the narrator's attitude towards the characters, the places, and events. And so I have Toni Morrison, who's the greatest writer, right, of this generation, and her image on there. As we approach, like for instance, a Toni Morrison book like Beloved, we have to think about what is her attitude to the characters of place events, because that's going to reveal some biases. And so Aristotle wants us to be aware of those biases as the viewer, right? And wants us to know what is being emphasized, what's being dropped, right? What's going to be what is going to be stressed in order to understand what the author is trying to get us to see or to get us to understand. And so Aristotle says that diction and tone is particularly important. So we have to pay attention to the words and what the words actually signify, right? What signifies the mood of the author. Spectacle is similar to setting. This is the time and place in which the work takes place. And so this is also, we talked about this before with literary criticism. This helps us to understand the location, and location becomes part of the character, becomes part of the story itself. Characterization is the process of making the characters appear real. Generally, characters will have clear goals and learn a life lesson, right? So they kind of there's a moral to be told generally, according to Aristotle. Aristotle says that tragic characters generally are people of great esteem that fall from grace, right? And so the difference with a tragedy is that you have someone that's up on a, kind of someone that's regarded well, and then they fall for some, unexplained or some, tragic reason. David, right? We talked about Michelangelo's David is an example of a tragic character falling from grace. Here we see Simba is kind of that. He is the prince, the next king of the jungle or the savannah in Lion King. But he falls as he leaves his people and goes off to live with Timon and Pumbaa. Or we have Darth Vader, right, who has this kind of esteem, all of this hope and aspirations in his talent, and then he chooses a different path. And so, any type of character that has this kind of esteem and falls is going to be a tragic character, and that fall is going to get us to identify with that as the audience draws us in, and then that's where that human suffering is felt. Recognition. Some other important elements I want you to think about. Recognition is a change in the protagonist from ignorance to knowledge that leads to a change in the protagonist's behavior, either for positive or for negative, right? And so what we see is that there's something that happens, right, that causes the character to then change his or her behavior. And as we see here, this is from Kung Fu Panda, right? His kind of realization that he is the chosen one kind of comes at the end of the story, and that causes him to change his understanding of the world, his outlook, right? That he then has more power than he realized that he had, right? But this must be shown rather than implied, right? So can't just be at the end and then all of a sudden the credits roll and you don't necessarily see any significant change. Yeah, I think that we really have to emphasize here that it has to be shown rather than implied. Reversal is just when events develop in one direction and then suddenly change to another direction. And so it could be, rags to riches, someone that starts poor and then in the process of the story, becomes, wealthy, or vice versa, starts wealthy and then becomes poor. Or in this case, the reversal is kind of the change in fortune for Luke is when he finds out that his father is actually Darth Vader, right? So reversal, when events are going in one direction and then there's a sudden change in that direction. Hamartia it literally means missing the mark, according to Aristotle. It's a miscalculation. It's an error or tragic flaw that leads to suffering or misfortune. This happens when a character does not recognize a fact or truth that could have saved him or her. And an example that I want you to think about, for instance, is just within Aladdin. When Genie's trying to, console Aladdin, and Aladdin doesn't know what to do because he doesn't want Jasmine to figure out that he's not really Prince. And the genie says, tell her the truth, right? And if he would have realized this, if Aladdin would have recognized this and then freed Genie, you wouldn't have had Jafar becoming this, kind of powerful, well, I don't remember what he was, a sorcerer or whatever he was. You wouldn't have the rest of the events, right? Everything else would have just kind of been fine, right? But he doesn't recognize that. He doesn't trust her enough, and so the events happen that lead to further suffering and or misfortune. Hubris, this is more specific than hamartia. It's an arrogance, excessive pride that leads to suffering or misfortune. Hubris and hamartia could have the same moment in the story, but they don't necessarily have to be. One could have hamartia without hubris, right? So hubris is much more specific, right? So with Aladdin, it's not necessarily, I mean, maybe it was pride that he didn't want to tell her the truth, but I don't know if that necessarily was. Mainly what we see is this is excessive pride, right, that leads to suffering. I think David is an example, right? Michelangelo's David, referring to the Old Testament, is an example of excessive pride, right? He's kind of on the roof, he's doing things that he shouldn't be doing, staying longer than he should, and then, calling on Bathsheba to come to his place, right? So we have this character that has reached this esteem in the eyes of God, and then he eventually falls. And we see a similar element to this with the Lion King, right? The Lion King is a good example of a tragedy in the modern world where we have Simba running away because of his pride, because he doesn't want to face the consequences of what he feels is that he caused the death of his father, and so he decides to run away as well, right? So his pride, his inability to face, I mean, he's really young here, so I'm not putting too much weight on this, but his, he making that mistake, and that leads to further suffering of his pride. Epiphany is a moment of sudden change or insight that leads to a positive change in behavior. Where recognition could be positive or negative, epiphany is positive, right? And this again must be shown rather than implied. And so, an example of this would be Shrek, right? When he gets this kind of moment, sudden moment of insight and understanding at the end, when she changes into an ogre and he says, "Oh, well, that explains a lot." So he then has this kind of different kind of outlook, right? So an epiphany is a sudden moment of change that leads to a positive change in behavior. I think we could actually argue, though, that in Shrek, that moment actually happened a little bit sooner when he's actually talking with Donkey, and he then, apologizes to Donkey, and then Donkey, tells him, "Hey, go and talk to Fiona yourself." And that moment of, changing his behavior and actually showing up at the wedding probably is a better example of epiphany. But this one is a good visual representation of that, where she's actually literally changing in front of his eyes. Aristotelian plot. This is kind of one of the main things I want you to know. This is a series of events in the story that are either simple or complex. A simple plot occurs without a reversal or recognition and of the protagonist, right? So a simple plot doesn't necessarily have that change of the protagonist, change in insight, change in direction. A complex plot is when there is a change in fortune that occurs with reversal and recognition of the protagonist. And so there is a change in fortune, and then the protagonist changes accordingly. It could be positive, it could be negative, right? The reversal and recognition must be shown rather than implied. And so something to think about, is it a simple plot or is it a complex plot? It depends on how well the main character, the protagonist, changes within the context of the story. And then the reader, right? The reading and the audience are an important part of Aristotle's ideas because it's how we are identifying with the plot, right? Authors write a story not just for it to be in a vacuum, but they write it to share to others, right? So they're writing stories with the audience in mind. How do I get the audience involved in the story? How do I get them engaged within the characters and the plot? Pity, right? Pity is the feeling that the reader or audience feels for the misfortune of the protagonist. This fortune can be a fall from good fortune or repetition. So it's when we feel sorrow for the mistakes that the characters are making, right? Fear is a feeling that we feel, right? It's a feeling of that the reader feels for recognizing that the same misfortune can happen to him or her, right? And so as we take a look at this, I mean, it's not necessarily to say that like with Knives Out, there's those events are so extreme that we're feeling that maybe, we're going to end up in a family that everyone's trying to kill one person. It's not that we're fearing that, right? But we're fearing something like that it could happen, something that we could have some type of family discord, and we're recognizing that there could be family problems. Or it could be that we could be driven by greed, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be specific to, everything that happens within the play. It could be something more general that we recognize, and this is how we identify within the story. A catharsis is the purging of pity and fear, right? These emotions in art. And so a catharsis is when those emotions of pity and fear are released from us. The moment when the audience's fear and pity are overcome, it's an emotional release from the reader or audience that generally happens at the end of the story. And so there's kind of a moment of release, right, where the conflict is then resolved. It's a catharsis. And so something else to think about. And then finally, this is very similar to where we left off in part one, the thought, right? The underlining idea or statement that a work makes about a subject. And this again, Aristotle wants us to think about this, right? What's the theme? What's the moral of the story? It generally is when the protagonist or protagonists learn from the events, right? And so according to him, because literature is generally told with authors telling them with a thought in mind, right, with a story to share, with a message to convey. Um, Generally, that this is what we are to learn from it. According to Aristotle, the thought is what the audience is to learn from the story. And so here's what I want you to think about how, and for part one and part two, I want you to think about these ideas as you approach literature, right? These ideas are what critics, right, people that are in the field are thinking about, how they're seeing literature, how they approach it. And so rather than just kind of approaching it of, oh, there's a certain word requirement or certain length, or I have to read for 20 minutes or whatever the case may be, they're actively thinking about these ideas, right? Whether it's conscious or subconscious. By the point in my life, I've been doing this for so long that this has become second nature to me. I'm not actually actively like writing out each specific one, but I did start there, right? I did start with each of the characters. I did start kind of outlining things. But now it's become more second nature, and that these things are just kind of in the back of my mind as I'm reading a particular story, and I'll just jot down ideas within the margins of a particular story for me to kind of go back to and to think about what my thoughts were as I was reading through it. But I just want to show of what critics do as they approach a story to be able to deepen your appreciation of literature that will hopefully set a foundation for reading literature throughout your life.